In the mist-shrouded mountains of West Virginia, a 17-year-old girl in duct-taped combat boots was about to face the ultimate test of survival. What started as a morning run through familiar Appalachian trails took a shocking turn when she came face-to-face with a government recruiter who would change her life forever. Lena Grace Walker wasn't your typical small-town teenager. For 3 years since her mother's death in a coal mine explosion, she had spent her life mastering wilderness survival skills taught by her Vietnam veteran grandfather, known for her ability to navigate 20 miles of mountain terrain without a compass and start fires in rainstorms. When she encountered the thin envelope bearing a government seal offering her a place in the elite National Tactical Survival Trials, she had no idea she was walking into a world designed to break her spirit. Lena accepted the challenge that would lead her from the green hills of home to the brutal Nevada desert, where privileged candidates with elite training would dismiss her as a backwoods misfit. What began as mockery over her handmade boots would become a proving ground where authentic grit trumped polished credentials. The military establishment would never be the same after this mountain girl showed them that true strength isn't found in expensive gear or family connections. It's forged in places where survival depends on wisdom passed down through generations and the courage to lead when everything falls apart. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mist clung to the Appalachian ridgeline like smoke from an old coal fire, thick and gray in the pre-dawn darkness. Lena Grace Walker's boots struck the dirt path, with the steady rhythm of someone who'd run this route 1,000 times before. Each footfall sent small pebbles skittering down the mountainside, the only sound besides her controlled breathing, and the distant hoot of a great horned owl calling from the hollow below. Her combat boots weren't much to look at. Duct tape wrapped around the left toe where the leather had split, rubber soles cut from old mining equipment and stitched on by hand. The leather had belonged to her mother once, part of an Army Rangers kit that had survived 2 tours overseas only to end up in a West Virginia coal mine. Lena had rebuilt them piece by piece when she outgrew her sneakers, using techniques her grandfather Boone had taught her on quiet evenings in his workshop. "If something's worth doing, Lena girl, it's worth doing right," his gravelly voice echoed in her memory as she rounded the bend toward Lookout Point. "Don't matter if nobody sees the work you put in. The work knows. And that's enough." At 17, Lena had been invisible in Pine Ridge for so long that people forgot to notice when she started becoming extraordinary. While her classmates slept in on Saturday mornings, she was already 5 miles into her run, navigating by starlight and instinct through terrain that would challenge experienced hikers. While they complained about the quarter-mile track at school, she was teaching herself to read topographic maps and practicing fire starting with flint and steel. The town whispered about her, but not unkindly. "That Walker girl's always been different," they'd say, the way people talk about wildflowers growing through sidewalk cracks. Remarkable, but not quite natural. Her mother's death 3 years ago had been the kind of accident that haunts small mining towns. A methane pocket, a single spark, and Sarah Grace Walker had died trying to evacuate 17 other miners. The newspaper called her a hero. Lena called her gone. That's when the running started. First, just to the end of their gravel driveway and back, then to the main road. Then up the mountain paths her mother used to hike on weekends, carrying Lena on her shoulders and pointing out deer trails and hawk nests. By the time Lena was 16, she could navigate 20 miles of mountain terrain without a compass, find water by following animal paths, and start a fire in a rainstorm. Boone never asked why she ran. He just made sure she ate enough to fuel the miles and taught her everything Sarah would have: how to read weather and the way clouds moved across ridgelines, how to tell direction by moss growth and star positions, how to move through the woods like a ghost. "Your mama always said you had wolf eyes," he told her one evening as she stretched on the porch after a particularly long run. "See things others miss. Feel things others ignore. That's a gift, but it's a lonely one." The envelope arrived on a Tuesday in March, thin and official-looking with a government seal. Lena had applied to the National Tactical Survival Trials program on a whim after reading about it in an outdated military magazine at the library. The application process had been brutal. Psychological evaluations, fitness assessments, background checks that probably revealed every parking ticket in 3 counties. She'd honestly forgotten about it until Mrs. Henderson at the library mentioned that someone had been asking questions about her. What kind of questions? Lena had asked, but Mrs. Henderson just smiled and handed her a stack of advanced wilderness survival manuals that hadn't been there the day before. Now, holding the envelope with shaking hands, Lena felt something shift in her chest. The letter was brief, almost bureaucratic in its precision. Congratulations. Report to Holloman Air Force Base, Nevada, April 15th for NTST Phase 1 selection. Transportation provided. Boone read the letter twice, his weathered hands careful with the paper like it might crumble. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with something Lena had rarely seen there, pride mixed with worry. Your mama would be over the moon, he said quietly. Always said you were destined for something bigger than these hills. I don't even know if I can do it, Grandpa. These people, they've probably been training their whole lives. They'll have real gear, real trainers. And you, Boone interrupted, standing slowly and walking to the mantelpiece where Sarah's purple heart sat in a frame. You've got something they don't. You've got hunger, you've got heart, and you've got boots that know where they've been. The night before she left, Boone gave her a small compass that had belonged to his grandfather. It's not much, he said, pressing the worn brass into her palm, but it's never pointed me wrong. Sometimes when all the fancy equipment fails, the simple things remember their job. Lena tucked it into the inside pocket of her mother's old military jacket, right next to her heart. The government transport was a plain white van that picked her up at the bus station in Charleston. The driver, a silent man in civilian clothes, handed her a folder with travel documents and pointed to the back seat. As the van pulled away from Pine Ridge, Lena pressed her face to the window, watching the familiar green hills blur into memory. She was the only passenger, which somehow made the journey feel even more surreal. 6 hours of interstate highway. Then the landscape began to change from rolling hills to flat plains, and finally to the stark, alien beauty of the Nevada desert. Her combat boots clicked against the metal floor of the van as she shifted nervously in her seat, the sound somehow reassuring. Whatever was waiting for her at Holloman Air Force Base, she'd meet it on her own terms in her own boots, carrying everything her mother and grandfather had taught her about what it meant to survive. The Nevada sun hit like a physical wall the moment Lena stepped out of the transport van. The air was thin and dry, nothing like the humid embrace of Appalachian mornings, and the heat shimmered off the tarmac in waves that made the distant mountains look like mirages. Holloman Air Force Base stretched out before her, geometric buildings of tan concrete and glass, aircraft hangars that looked large enough to house small towns, and everywhere the purposeful movement of people who belonged to something bigger than themselves. Lena adjusted the strap of her duffel bag, a canvas military surplus relic that Boone had carried in Vietnam, and tried not to feel like she'd accidentally wandered onto an alien planet. Walker? Lena Grace? A woman in desert camouflage approached, clipboard in hand and expression entirely unreadable behind wraparound sunglasses. Staff Sergeant Ellie Ramirez, according to her name tape, moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd learned to waste neither motion nor words. Follow me. The processing building was mercifully air-conditioned, but that was where Lena's comfort ended. The lobby buzzed with activity, other recruits checking in, officers reviewing files, administrative personnel managing the controlled chaos of intake day. And everywhere, the stairs. Lena became acutely aware of how she looked compared to the other candidates. They stood in small clusters, their gear matching and expensive-looking, their postures confident in the way that only came from a lifetime of being told you were exceptional. Designer athletic wear in military colors. Hiking boots that probably cost more than Lena's family spent on groceries in a month. Tactical backpacks with more zippers and compartments than seemed physically possible. Then there was Lena, in faded jeans and her mother's old army jacket, carrying everything she owned in one bag and wearing boots held together with duct tape and determination. Is she lost? The whisper came from somewhere to her left, followed by poorly suppressed laughter. Maybe she's here for the custodial program, another voice suggested, not bothering to lower the volume. That's the Alabama girl, a third voice added with the kind of casual cruelty that passed for humor in certain circles. Probably thinks a semiconductor is someone who drives a truck part-time. Lena's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes forward and her expression neutral. She'd learned long ago that responding to mockery only invited more of it. Instead, she focused on the process: forms to fill out, medical examinations to complete, briefings to attend. The official orientation took place in a sterile conference room, with fluorescent lighting and motivational posters featuring eagles and inspirational quotes about excellence. Captain Ryland Monroe entered like he was walking onto a parade ground, his bearing so perfectly military that he seemed to create his own gravitational field of authority. Monroe was probably in his early 40s, with graying hair cut to regulation standards and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing confident, and when he spoke, it was with the assumption that every word carried the weight of absolute truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily through the room, "welcome to the National Tactical Survival Trials. For the next 8 weeks, you will be tested beyond anything you've experienced in your comfortable lives. Some of you will prove worthy of advancement, most of you will not." His gaze swept the room, lingering momentarily on each face. When his eyes met Lena's, she caught a flicker of something. Not hostility exactly, but skepticism so deep it bordered on dismissal. This program was designed to identify individuals capable of operating in the most extreme circumstances our nation might face. We need operators who can think clearly under pressure, adapt to rapidly changing conditions, and maintain peak performance when everything around them is falling apart. His voice dropped slightly, becoming more personal. "We do not need tourists. We do not need participants. We need warriors." During the individual introductions that followed, Lena listened to the credentials of her fellow candidates with growing amazement. Travis Langston, son of General Robert Langston, had attended Phillips Exeter Academy before West Point Prep, where he'd been captain of both the cross-country team and the Tactical Strategy Club. Madeline Chen had graduated summa cum laude from MIT with a degree in aeronautical engineering and held patents in drone navigation systems. David Kim had been recruited from the Navy SEALs training pipeline after breaking 3 endurance records at Bud/S. When her turn came, Lena stood slowly, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes. "Lena Walker, Pine Ridge, West Virginia, I run." The silence that followed was deafening. Someone in the back row snorted. Monroe studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "What do you run from, Miss Walker?" "I don't run from anything, sir. I run to see what I can catch up to." It wasn't eloquent, but it was honest, and something in Monroe's expression shifted slightly, though whether toward respect or dismissal, Lena couldn't tell. After the orientation, candidates were divided into preliminary training squads. Lena watched with a sinking heart as the obvious leaders were selected first: Travis, Madeline, David, others whose names had been mentioned with reverence during introductions. She was assigned to Squad B, which she quickly realized was military speak for the leftovers. Her squad mates included Keisha K2 Davenport, a loud, energetic girl from Detroit who cracked jokes to hide her nervousness; Marcus Webb, a quiet farm boy from Iowa who looked as out of place as Lena felt; and Sarah Chen, no relation to Madeline, a soft-spoken medic from Oregon who seemed more interested in helping people than competing with them. "Don't look so thrilled," K2 said, catching Lena's expression. "Squad B might stand for Squad Bottom, but at least we know where we stand, right? Better than pretending we're something we're not." As they were dismissed for their first evening meal, Lena caught Sergeant Ramirez watching her from across the room, making notes on a tablet with the focused attention of someone conducting an experiment. Their eyes met briefly, and Ramirez nodded almost imperceptibly before turning away. That night, lying on her narrow bunk in the barracks she shared with 15 other women, Lena listened to the quiet conversations around her. Stories of preparatory schools and private trainers, of family traditions, of military service and connections that opened doors before their owners even knew they wanted to walk through them. She pulled Boone's compass from under her pillow, feeling the weight of the worn brass in her palm. The needle pointed steadily north, unwavering despite everything around it that was foreign and uncertain. Tomorrow, she knew, the real testing would begin. And despite the whispers and stares, despite being assigned to the squad nobody expected to succeed, Lena felt something settling in her chest. Not confidence exactly, but a quiet certainty that she hadn't come this far to fold at the first sign of resistance. Her combat boots sat beside her bunk, ready for whatever came next. They'd carried her through worse than skeptical looks and privileged laughter. They'd carry her through this too. The first field exercise began at 0500 hours with the harsh clang of a metal triangle being beaten outside the barracks. Lena had been awake since 0430, a habit born from years of early morning runs, but most of her squad mates stumbled out of their bunks with the disoriented confusion of people unaccustomed to military schedules. "Move it, people!" Sergeant Ramirez's voice cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade. "You've got 15 minutes to gear up and report to the assembly area." Anyone not ready gets to explain to Captain Monroe why they think the enemy will wait for them to find their socks. The Nevada desert before sunrise was surprisingly cold, the air sharp enough to make breath visible in small puffs. Lena had layered carefully, her mother's jacket over a thermal shirt, with gloves that had once belonged to Boone tucked into her pockets. Around her, other candidates hopped from foot to foot in expensive athletic wear that looked designed more for a sporting goods catalog than actual fieldwork. Monroe appeared with military punctuality, flanked by 3 instructors carrying clipboards and stopwatches. In the pale light of emergency flood lamps, his face looked carved from stone. "Today you begin your introduction to operational terrain navigation," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the assembled group. "You'll be working in your assigned squads to complete a 5-mile circuit through the training area. Each squad will receive identical maps and compass bearings. The exercise is timed, but speed is not the primary objective. We're evaluating your ability to work as a team, adapt to changing conditions, and maintain situational awareness." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the 3 squads. "The terrain you'll be crossing is not forgiving. Heat exhaustion is a real threat, even at this hour. Twisted ankles happen when people stop paying attention to where they step. The desert doesn't care about your GPA or your family name. It only responds to competence." Travis Langston raised his hand with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his questions welcomed. "Sir, what kind of navigation equipment will we be provided?" "Each squad gets 1 compass and 1 topographic map," Monroe replied. "Everything else, you figure out." The murmur of concern that rippled through the group was audible. Lena caught several candidates pulling out GPS watches and smartphones, their faces falling as they realized their technological advantages had just been neutralized. Squad A, led by Travis, departed first with military precision. Their formation was textbook perfect, their gear distribution logical, their pace confident and steady. Watching them disappear into the desert scrub, Lena felt a familiar pang of doubt. Maybe the whispers were right. Maybe she was out of her league. Squad C followed 10 minutes later, led by Madeline Chen with the systematic approach of an engineer solving a complex problem. They'd spent their preparation time analyzing the topographic map, with the intensity of scholars studying ancient texts, marking waypoints and calculating distances with mathematical precision. Finally, Squad B's turn arrived. K2 bounced nervously on her toes, cracking jokes to hide her anxiety. Marcus Webb studied their assigned map with the furrowed concentration of someone trying to decode hieroglyphics. Sarah Chen checked and rechecked her medical kit, clearly more comfortable with the idea of treating injuries than preventing them. "So, Walker," K2 said as they set off into the gray pre-dawn landscape, "you're our mountain girl. This desert thing's similar to your backyard hiking." "Different terrain, same principles," Lena replied, accepting the compass from Marcus. The moment the brass instrument settled in her palm, something clicked into place, a feeling she recognized from countless mornings navigating the ridgelines above Pine Ridge. The land wants to tell you where you are, if you know how to listen. 20 minutes into the exercise, they encountered their first challenge. The designated path led down into a wash, a dry riverbed carved deep into the desert floor by flash floods. According to the map, they should have been able to follow it east for half a mile before climbing out at a marked ravine. But the wash was blocked by a recent rock slide that hadn't been marked on their materials. "Shit," Marcus muttered, staring at the pile of boulders and debris that made passage impossible. "What do we do now?" "We could backtrack," Sarah suggested. "Find another way around." "That'll add at least 30 minutes, K2 pointed out. "The other squads probably hit this same problem. They're gonna smoke us if we take the long way." Lena knelt beside the rock slide, studying the terrain with the focused attention Boone had taught her. The wash walls were steep, but not impossible. More importantly, she could see scrub growth patterns that suggested water flow. Even in the desert, plants told stories about the landscape's hidden features. "There," she said, pointing to a section of the eastern wall where a faint game trail zigzagged up the slope. "Animals made that path. If deer can get up there, so can we." "That's not on the map," Marcus protested. "The map's 2 years old," Lena replied, already shouldering her pack. "The land changes. Animals adapt. We can too." The climb was harder than it looked, loose rock and thorny scrub that grabbed at clothing and skin. But Lena moved with the confident rhythm of someone who'd spent years navigating mountain slopes, testing each foothold, reading the rock face for the most stable route. Behind her, she could hear her squad mates following, their breathing getting heavier as they climbed. At the top, they found themselves on a plateau that offered a perfect view of the surrounding terrain. From this vantage point, Lena could see Squad A in the distance, still struggling with the rockslide blockage. Squad C was attempting to scale the western wall of the wash, their technical approach hampered by the unpredictable nature of desert stone. "Holy shit, Walker," K2 gasped, catching her breath. "How'd you know about that trail?" "Animals are honest," Lena replied, checking her compass bearing. "They don't make paths they can't use, and they don't waste energy unless there's a good reason." The rest of the exercise unfolded like a revelation. Where the other squads struggled with navigation, Lena read the subtle signs that made direction clear. The way shadows fell across rock faces, the patterns of vegetation that indicated seasonal water flow, the behavior of birds that suggested the presence of landmarks not marked on any map. When Marcus twisted his ankle descending into a canyon, Lena fashioned a walking stick from a dead Joshua tree branch and reorganized their formation so Sarah could monitor him while K2 took point with the compass. She didn't take command so much as the team naturally reorganized around her competence. They finished the exercise 45 minutes ahead of the next closest squad, and were waiting at the checkpoint when Squad A finally limped in, Travis Langston looking significantly less confident than he had at the starting line. Monroe reviewed their time with an expression that might have been surprise if military bearing allowed for such emotions. "Squad B," he said, consulting his clipboard, completed the circuit in 3 hours and 22 minutes, with all team members accounted for and no significant injuries. He looked up at Lena directly. "That's the fastest time we've recorded for this exercise in 2 years. "Just lucky, sir," Lena replied, but she caught the look Sergeant Ramirez gave her from across the checkpoint area, appraising, thoughtful, and definitely not dismissive. As they walked back toward the base, K2 fell into step beside her. "That wasn't luck back there, was it?" she asked quietly. "No," Lena admitted. "That was listening. Think you could teach the rest of us how to hear what you hear?" Lena looked back at the desert landscape, thinking of Boone's patient lessons and her mother's legacy of paying attention to what others overlooked. "I can try," she said, and for the first time since arriving at Holloman, she thought maybe, just maybe, she might actually belong here after all. The satellite blackout exercise was announced during the pre-dawn briefing on their 10th day at Holloman. Captain Monroe stood before a room of increasingly hollow-eyed candidates, his bearing as crisp as ever, despite the punishing schedule they'd all been enduring. The desert had a way of wearing people down. The heat, the altitude, the constant pressure of evaluation. And Lena could see it in the slouched shoulders and 1,000-yard stares around her. "At 0800 hours, all electronic navigation aids will be rendered inoperable," Monroe announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "GPS devices, smartphones, digital compasses, everything that requires a satellite signal will cease to function. You'll have 48 hours to complete a 12-mile circuit using only traditional navigation methods." A ripple of unease passed through the assembled candidates. Over the past week and a half, Lena had watched her fellow recruits rely increasingly on their high-tech gear. GPS watches that calculated pace and distance, smartphone apps that could identify stars and predict weather patterns, digital compasses that never wavered and required no interpretation of magnetic declination. This scenario simulates conditions you might encounter during electronic warfare or in regions where satellite coverage is compromised, Monroe continued. In the field, you cannot depend on technology that can be jammed, hacked, or simply fail at the worst possible moment. Today, we discover who among you can navigate by the fundamentals. Travis Langston raised his hand with less confidence than he'd shown in previous exercises. "Sir, Will we have backup communication devices in case of emergency? Emergency signal flares only, Monroe replied curtly. Use them unnecessarily, and you're automatically disqualified from the program. The exercise began with each squad being transported to different drop-off points around the perimeter of the training area. Squad B found themselves deposited beside a dried-up stock pond, surrounded by scrub brush and red rock formations that all looked frustratingly similar. The electronic jamming equipment activated at precisely 0800, marked by the simultaneous beeping and powering down of every GPS device in sight. Well, shit, K2 muttered, staring at her now useless fitness tracker. Guess we're going old school. Marcus pulled out their assigned topographic map, spreading it on the ground like a sacred text. According to this, we should be somewhere around here, he said, pointing to a blue dot that represented the stock pond. But there's like 6 other ponds marked in this area. How do we know which one we're actually at? Lena knelt beside the map, running her fingers over the contour lines that represented the subtle rises and falls of the desert landscape. Back home, she could navigate the mountain ridges in her sleep, reading the land like a familiar book. But this desert terrain was different, more subtle, less forgiving of mistakes. The sun, she said finally, pulling out the compass Boone had given her. It's 0830 now. See how the shadow from that big rock formation falls? That tells us direction better than any GPS ever could. She stood, scanning the horizon with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to finding their way by landmarks most people never noticed. There, see that double-peaked hill about 3 miles northeast? It's marked on the map as Scorpion Ridge. And that wash running east-west? It should connect to our route about 2 miles out. Sarah Chen looked skeptical. Are you sure? Everything out here looks the same to me. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Desert's like anywhere else, Lena replied, shouldering her pack. You just have to learn its language. They set off across the broken terrain, Lena leading with the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned to trust their instincts. Behind her, she could hear her squad mate's initial nervousness gradually giving way to something like trust. When the marked path disappeared into a maze of identical-looking arroyos, she navigated by reading the subtle differences in rock color that indicated seasonal water flow. When clouds obscured their landmark ridge, she found direction in the way the wind carved patterns in the sand. 2 hours into the exercise, they encountered Madeline Chen from Squad C, sitting alone beside a cluster of boulders, with tears streaking down her dust-covered cheeks. Mads? K2 called out, jogging ahead. What happened? Where's your team? Madeline looked up with the hollow expression of someone whose confidence had just been shattered against reality. Her expensive tactical gear was covered in dust, her precisely calculated route notes scattered by the desert wind. I got separated, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We were following what I thought was the correct bearing. But then the terrain didn't match the map, and everyone started arguing about which way to go. David said we should double back, but Travis insisted we push forward, and I tried to check my calculations, but without GPS verification. Her voice trailed off into frustrated silence. When did you last see them? Lena asked, kneeling beside the other girl. Maybe an hour ago? They went that way. Madeline pointed vaguely toward a ridge that looked identical to dozens of others. I was trying to recalibrate our position when they just left me. K2's expression darkened. They left you? Just abandoned you out here? Travis said I was slowing them down with my analysis paralysis, Madeline replied bitterly. Said this wasn't MIT, and I needed to learn to make decisions without running probability calculations on everything. Lena studied their map, then looked at the terrain around Madeline's position. If Squad C had been following the bearing Madeline indicated, they were probably lost themselves by now, pushing deeper into an area that would take them miles off course. You can come with us, Lena said simply. I can't. That's probably against the rules. The rules say complete the circuit with your assigned squad, Sarah interjected. They don't say anything about helping someone who's been abandoned. Marcus nodded agreement. Besides, we're not exactly overstaffed ourselves. Madeline looked up at Lena with something like wonder. Why would you help me? I'm not even in your squad. And after how I treated you during orientation, Lena remembered the eye rolls and dismissive comments from those first days, but they seemed unimportant now compared to the lost, frightened girl sitting in the desert dust. "Because," she said, offering Madeline her hand, "the mountains taught me that you don't leave people behind. The desert's probably the same way." With 5 team members instead of 4, their dynamics shifted. Madeline's analytical mind, once freed from the pressure of GPS-dependent precision, proved invaluable for calculating distances and interpreting contour lines. She approached navigation like an engineering problem, breaking down each decision into component parts that could be logically evaluated. "If we maintain this bearing for approximately 2.3 miles, she said, consulting both map and compass, we should intersect with the marked trail just before it starts climbing toward Checkpoint Charlie. "Sounds right," Lena agreed, though she was navigating more by intuition than calculation. Something about the way the late morning light hit the rock formations ahead felt familiar, like an echo of countless mornings spent finding her way through the Appalachian wilderness. They found Squad C 3 hours later, thoroughly lost and arguing among themselves beside a dried-up creek bed that wasn't marked on any map. David Kim was studying their topographic chart with the intense frustration of someone trying to force reality to match expectations. Travis paced back and forth, his earlier confidence replaced by barely controlled panic. "Walker?" Travis looked up as Squad B approached, his expression cycling through relief, embarrassment, and annoyance. "What are you doing here? Where's Chen?" "Right here," Madeline said, stepping out from behind Lena with her chin raised defiantly. "Where you left me." "We didn't leave you," David protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "You said you needed to recalculate." "I said I needed 5 minutes to verify our position," Madeline shot back. "When I looked up, you were gone." Travis's face reddened. "This isn't a classroom exercise, Chen. In the field, you adapt, or you get left behind. That's how it works." "No," Lena said quietly, but her voice carried clearly across the creek bed. "That's how people die." She pulled out their map, spreading it on a flat rock. "You're here," she said, pointing to a spot about 2 miles southeast of their intended route. "See this drainage pattern? You followed the wrong branch of the wash system. Happens easy when you're moving fast and not paying attention to the landscape." Travis studied the map with growing comprehension and embarrassment. Their mistake was obvious once Lena pointed it out, a navigation error that any first-year orienteering student should have caught. "How do we get back on course?" David asked, his tone notably more respectful than it had been during their first week. Lena traced a route with her finger. "Follow this draw northwest until it meets the main trail. Should put you back on track in about an hour if you don't waste time arguing." As Squad C prepared to move out, Travis lingered behind, his expression uncharacteristically thoughtful. "Walker," he said quietly, "I owe you one. And Chen?" "I'm sorry. About leaving you behind. That was—" He struggled for words. "That wasn't right." "No," Madeline agreed coolly, "it wasn't." After Squad C disappeared over the ridge, K2 shook her head in amazement. "Girl, you just saved the Golden Boy's ass. And he knows it." "Doesn't matter," Lena replied, folding their map. "We still have 6 miles to go, and the afternoon heat's going to be brutal." Quote, they completed their circuit just as the sun was setting, painting the desert landscape in shades of red and gold that reminded Lena powerfully of autumn evenings in the mountains. Their time was respectable. Not the fastest, but well within the acceptable range. And more importantly, they'd finished with all team members accounted for and no one requiring medical attention. Sergeant Ramirez was waiting at the checkpoint with her ever-present clipboard, but when she looked up from recording their arrival time, Lena caught something new in her expression, a calculating interest that hadn't been there before. "Squad B +1, Ramirez noted, glancing at Madeline. "Care to explain the extra team member?" "Found her abandoned by Squad C," K2 replied bluntly. "Wasn't going to leave her for the coyotes." Ramirez made a note on her clipboard. "And how did you locate Squad C to return Miss Chen?" "They were lost," Lena said simply. "We helped them find their way." "I see." Ramirez's pen moved across the page with thoughtful precision. "And you were able to navigate successfully using only traditional methods?" "Yes, ma'am. Compass, map, and common sense." "Interesting," Ramirez looked up from her notes. Most of the other squads required assistance at least once. Squad A had to use their emergency flare after getting completely turned around in the southern sector. Several others are still out there. As they walked back toward base, Madeline fell into step beside Lena. "Thank you," she said quietly, "not just for the rescue, for showing me that I was thinking about all this wrong. I was so focused on making the technology work that I forgot to actually look at where I was." "Easy mistake," Lena replied. "I've been navigating without GPS my whole life, so it feels natural. But I bet there's plenty of stuff you could teach me about analyzing terrain data and calculating precise bearings." "Maybe we could help each other," Madeline suggested. "Your instincts, my analysis. Might be a good combination." "Might be," Lena agreed, and for the first time since arriving at Holloman, she felt like she might be making a real friend instead of just earning respect. That night, as she lay in her bunk listening to the desert wind howl across the base, Lena pulled out Boone's compass and watched the needle settle steadily north. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her abilities and resolve. But tonight, she felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Pine Ridge. The quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly where she stood and which direction she was heading. The emergency klaxon began wailing at 0347 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn stillness like a blade. Lena jerked awake instantly, years of early morning runs having trained her to go from deep sleep to full alertness in seconds. Around her, the barracks erupted into chaos as 32 women scrambled out of their bunks, grabbing gear and trying to process the flood of commands echoing from the speakers mounted near the ceiling. "All candidates to staging area Alpha immediately," the metallic voice announced. "This is not a drill. Full combat load. Move, move, move." The staging area was a confusion of floodlights and shouting instructors, candidates stumbling through the darkness in various states of readiness. Lena had learned to sleep partially dressed after the first few surprise drills, so she was among the first ready, standing at attention while others were still lacing boots and adjusting pack straps. Captain Monroe appeared with characteristic punctuality, despite the early hour looking as pressed and polished as if he'd been awake for hours. Behind him, Sergeant Ramirez and 2 other instructors carried equipment cases and what looked like emergency communication gear. "Ladies and gentlemen," Monroe began, his voice cutting through the pre-dawn confusion, "we have a situation developing in Training Sector 7. What began as a scheduled overnight survival exercise has been complicated by weather conditions that were not forecast." He gestured toward the eastern horizon, where Lena could now see flashes of lightning illuminating towering thunderheads. The storm front stretched across the desert like a wall of black water, and even from miles away she could hear the distant rumble of thunder. "Squad A began their 48-hour solo survival exercise yesterday afternoon," Monroe continued. "They were expected to check in via radio at 2,100 hours. We have received no communication since their initial deployment." A murmur of concern rippled through the assembled candidates. Solo survival exercises were considered the ultimate test. Candidates dropped alone in the desert with minimal gear, expected to navigate back to base using only their training and instincts. They were dangerous under the best conditions. In a storm, they could be lethal. "Meteorological reports indicate this system moved in faster and more intensely than predicted," Monroe said, consulting a tablet handed to him by one of the instructors. "We're looking at flash flood potential, 0 visibility conditions, and winds in excess of 60 miles per hour." Travis Langston raised his hand, his face pale in the harsh floodlights. "Sir, Squad A includes some of our top performers. Surely they'd have found adequate shelter." "Squad A," Monroe interrupted, "includes your roommate Peterson, who has never operated in conditions more challenging than a university climbing wall. It includes Martinez, whose idea of wilderness experience is summer camp in the Catskills. And it includes Henderson, who twisted her ankle during basic orienteering last week and may still be compromised." The implication hung heavy in the desert air. The candidates everyone had assumed were most prepared might be the least equipped to handle a real emergency. "All available personnel will participate in search and rescue operations," Monroe announced. "You'll be working in your standard squads, assigned to specific grid coordinates. This is not an exercise. Lives may depend on your performance." As the squads received their assignments and prepared to deploy, Lena found herself studying the weather reports with growing concern. The storm system showed all the characteristics of what Boone had called a mountain killer, the kind of fast-moving, violent weather that could turn familiar terrain into a death trap in minutes. Squad B was assigned to Grid Section 7 Charlie, a rough area of arroyos and boulder fields about 5 miles northeast of base. According to the topographic data, it was exactly the kind of terrain that would provide good shelter from wind and rain, which also made it exactly the kind of place where flash floods could trap the unwary. "Gear check," Lena called as her squad prepared to move out. Over the past 2 weeks, she'd gradually assumed informal leadership of Squad B, not through any official appointment, but through the simple expedient of consistently making good decisions under pressure. K2 held up her emergency kit. Water purification tablets, energy bars, first aid supplies, emergency blanket, signal flares. "Communications?" Lena asked. "Handheld radio, though the storm's playing hell with reception," Marcus replied, adjusting the frequency settings on their assigned unit. "I've got additional medical supplies," Sarah added, patting the expanded kit she carried. "Enough to handle serious injuries from multiple people." Madeline, who had been officially transferred to Squad B after the navigation exercise, consulted their digital tablet one final time before the storm made electronics unreliable. "Weather radar shows the storm center passing directly through our search area in approximately 90 minutes. After that, we'll have maybe a 6-hour window before the trailing edge brings another wave of severe weather." They loaded into the transport vehicle just as the first fat raindrops began spattering against the windshield. The drive to their grid section took 30 minutes through increasingly rough terrain, the driver navigating by headlights and GPS while lightning illuminated the landscape in stark, momentary snapshots. "Drop point in 2 minutes," the driver called back. "Radio check every 30 minutes. Or, whenever you find something, emergency frequencies are monitored continuously." The storm hit just as they were unloading their gear. Lena had experienced mountain thunderstorms before, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer violence of desert weather. The wind arrived first, a howling wall of air that nearly knocked her flat and sent their equipment flying. Then came the rain, not the steady downpour of Appalachian storms, but a torrential assault that turned the air itself into something almost too thick to breathe. "Stay together," she shouted over the wind, grabbing K2's arm as the other girls staggered against the force of the storm. "Find shelter until this passes." They took refuge behind a cluster of large boulders that provided some protection from the wind, huddling together while the storm raged around them. Lightning struck close enough to leave the smell of ozone in the air, and thunder crashed with physical force that Lena could feel in her chest. "Jesus Christ," Marcus muttered, pressing himself against the rock wall. "How are we supposed to find anyone in this?" "We wait," Lena replied, checking her compass. Even in the storm, it pointed steadily north, offering the only reliable reference point in a world gone chaotic. "Storm this violent can't last long. When it passes, we'll have a short window before the next cell hits." 20 minutes later, the wind began to subside, and the rain shifted from torrential to merely heavy. Lena peered around their boulder shelter, assessing the transformed landscape. What had been dry arroyos were now rushing rivers, and every low spot had become a temporary lake reflecting the lightning-illuminated clouds. "Move out," she called, shouldering her pack. "We've got maybe an hour before the next wave hits." They began their search pattern, moving carefully across terrain made treacherous by rushing water and slippery rock. Lena found herself drawing on every lesson Boone had taught her about reading dangerous weather, watching for the subtle signs that indicated where flash floods might strike next. "Lena!" Sarah's voice carried clearly across the noise of running water. "Over here!" She'd found something, not one of the missing candidates, but equipment. A high-end backpack, the kind issued to Squad A members, caught on a dead tree about 4 feet above the current water level in what had been a dry creek bed an hour earlier. "Whoever lost this got caught by the flood," Madeline observed, studying the debris pattern. "See how the vegetation is all bent downstream? Water came through here fast and high." K2 was already pulling out the radio. "Base, this is Squad B. We've found abandoned equipment in Grid 7 Charlie. Pack appears to belong to Squad A member. Coordinates follow." While she reported their find, Lena studied the surrounding terrain with growing urgency. If someone had been caught in this creek when the flood hit, they would have been swept downstream. But the water was moving fast enough to carry a person miles from where they'd started. "We need to follow the water flow," she announced. "If someone got caught in this flood, They're gonna be downstream, probably injured. Definitely in trouble. That takes us out of our assigned grid, Marcus pointed out. Our assigned grid doesn't have any people in it, Lena replied. The water does. They began moving downstream, fighting their way through terrain made nearly impassable by rushing water and fallen debris. The search was slow, dangerous work, testing each foothold, watching constantly for signs that the water level was rising again, stopping every few hundred yards to call out and listen for responses. They found Peterson 20 minutes later. He was wedged between two boulders about 50 yards from the main flow of water, conscious but badly injured. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and blood from a head wound had mixed with rainwater to paint pink streaks down his face. "Oh, thank God," he gasped when he saw them. I was sure nobody would find me out here." Sarah was beside him instantly, her medic training taking over. Possible concussion, definite fracture of the left tibia, she reported while examining his injuries. He's hypothermic and probably dehydrated, but stable. "How long have you been here?" Lena asked, kneeling beside him. Since the first wave of rain hit. "Maybe an hour?" Peterson's voice was weak but coherent. "I was looking for shelter when the water started rising. Came up so fast. I tried to get to higher ground, but I slipped on the rocks and got swept down here." "Where are the others from your squad?" K2 asked. Peterson's face crumpled. "I don't know. We got separated when the storm hit. Martinez was headed toward that big rock formation to the east. Henderson. I think she was trying to get back toward base, but she was moving slow because of her ankle." Lena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold rain soaking through her clothes. Martinez moving toward the eastern rocks would put him directly in the path of the next flood surge. Henderson, injured and moving slowly, could be anywhere, and if she was trying to navigate back toward base in zero visibility, she was probably lost and getting more lost by the minute. "Sarah, how long until Peterson's stable for transport?" she asked. "I can stabilize the leg fracture, but he needs a hospital," Sarah replied, working quickly to splint the injury with supplies from her kit. "Moving him's going to be risky, but leaving him here when the next storm cell hits would be worse. K2, get on the radio. Tell base we found Peterson, give them our coordinates, and request immediate medical evacuation." Lena studied the weather radar display on Madeline's tablet. "Next storm cell hits in 40 minutes. We need to find Martinez and Henderson before then, or they're going to die out here." "We can't split up in these conditions," Marcus protested. "Standard search and rescue protocols." "Standard protocols," Lena interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made life-and-death decisions in the mountains. "Assume you're dealing with people who know what they're doing. Martinez and Henderson are city kids playing dress-up in the desert. If we don't find them in the next 30 minutes, the storm's going to finish what we started." She looked around at her squad, K2 with her radio coordinating with base, Sarah working methodically to stabilize Peterson's injuries, Marcus and Madeline consulting maps and weather data with a focused intensity of people who understood the stakes. "We're going to split into two teams," she decided. "Marcus and Sarah stay with Peterson, coordinate the medevac, and establish a base camp here. Madeline, K2, and I are going to find Martinez. Once the helicopter extracts Peterson, Marcus and Sarah can start a grid search for Henderson." "That's against protocols," Marcus said again, but his voice lacked conviction. "Protocols," Lena replied, shouldering her pack and checking her compass, "are written by people who've never had to choose between following rules and saving lives." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and fresh lightning illuminated the storm front advancing across the desert. They had 30 minutes, maybe less, before the next wave hit. 30 minutes to find Martinez before the flash floods turned the arroyos into death traps. Lena had spent her entire life preparing for moments like this, not in classrooms or training facilities, but in the mountains of Appalachia, where mistakes meant exposure, and exposure meant dying. Now in the Nevada desert, with lives hanging in the balance, she was about to discover whether all those lonely pre-dawn runs had been preparing her for something bigger than anyone had imagined. Her combat boots found purchase on the slippery rock, and she began moving upstream toward the eastern formations, following her instincts and the storm-carved landscape toward whatever was waiting in the darkness. The rescue helicopter's rotors cut through the pre-dawn air like mechanical thunder, its searchlight sweeping across the desert floor in methodical arcs. From her position beside the makeshift landing zone, Lena watched the aircraft settle onto the rocky ground, its downwash kicking up clouds of sand and debris that stung her eyes and coated her already mud-streaked uniform. The past 6 hours felt like a lifetime compressed into fragments of memory, finding Martinez hypothermic and delirious beneath an overhang of rocks, carrying him bodily through waist-deep floodwater as the second storm cell hammered the landscape, locating Henderson 3 miles off course and nearly catatonic with exposure. 3 members of Squad A, the supposed elite, reduced to helpless victims by weather conditions that Lena had learned to navigate before she was old enough to drive. Peterson, Martinez, and Henderson are all stable, the flight medic called out over the helicopter's noise, securing the last of the stretchers. Good work out here. You probably saved their lives. As the aircraft lifted off toward the base hospital, Sergeant Ramirez approached through the swirling dust, her expression unreadable in the harsh glare of the emergency floodlights. She'd arrived with the second wave of search teams, coordinating the complex logistics of evacuating 3 injured candidates from terrain that had become nearly impassable. Squad B, she said, consulting her ever-present clipboard, you were assigned to Grid Section 7 Charlie. Can you explain why we found you 2 miles outside your designated search area? K2 stepped forward, mud-caked and exhausted but still radiating the defiant energy that had made her Lena's first real ally at Holloman. We followed the evidence, Sergeant, found Peterson's gear in our grid, tracked the flood pattern downstream, found Peterson wedged in those rocks. And the other 2 casualties? Martinez was exactly where Peterson said he'd be, Madeline added, her analytical mind still functioning despite the physical and emotional exhaustion. Based on the terrain features and weather patterns, his location was predictable if you understood the hydrology of flash floods. Henderson was the wild card, Lena said quietly. She panicked when the storm hit, tried to navigate back to base in 0 visibility. We found her about 3 miles southeast of where she should have been, moving in circles. Ramirez made notes with methodical precision. You split your squad against established protocols. You left your assigned search grid without authorization. You made tactical decisions that put additional personnel at risk. She looked up from her clipboard. Do you have anything to say in your defense? The question hung in the desert air like smoke. Around them, other search teams were packing equipment and preparing for transport back to base, their missions completed with varying degrees of success. Several squads had found nothing but empty desert. Others had located abandoned gear but no personnel. Only Squad B had actually rescued anyone. Yes, ma'am, Lena replied, meeting the sergeant's gaze steadily. I'd do it again. Quote. Ramirez's expression remained neutral. Even knowing you violated multiple safety protocols and operational procedures? Protocols don't save lives, Sergeant. People do. Protocols, Ramirez replied coolly, exist to prevent people from making decisions that get everyone killed. And sometimes, Lena countered, they prevent people from making decisions that save lives. The silence stretched between them for several seconds, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder from the departing storm system. Finally, Ramirez closed her clipboard and adjusted the strap of her equipment bag. Base wants to see you, she said. All of you. Debriefing starts in 30 minutes. The ride back to Holloman was conducted in tense silence. 5 exhausted candidates crammed into a military transport vehicle that smelled of diesel fuel and wet canvas. Through the windows, Lena watched the desert landscape slowly emerge from the storm's aftermath. Newly carved arroyos, debris scattered across what had been flat ground hours before, the occasional glint of metal marking where equipment had been lost to the floodwaters. She thought about Peterson's face when they'd found him, the relief and gratitude mixed with embarrassment that he'd needed rescuing at all. About Martinez, delirious with hypothermia, mumbling apologies for getting lost while she'd half-carried him through the rushing water. About Henderson, who'd broken down crying when they'd finally located her, admitting she'd been wandering in circles for hours without any idea where she was or how to get back. The debriefing room at base felt sterile and artificially bright after hours in the storm-darkened desert. Captain Monroe sat at a conference table flanked by 2 officers Lena didn't recognize, their uniforms bearing the insignia of higher command. File folders and tablets covered the surface before them, along with what appeared to be detailed maps of the search area, marked with colored pins indicating where each squad had operated. Squad B, Monroe began without preamble, you are here to explain your actions during last night's search and rescue operations. He opened one of the file folders, revealing what appeared to be GPS tracking data and radio transcripts. At 0445 hours, you were assigned to Grid Section 7 Charlie, with instructions to conduct systematic search patterns within defined boundaries. At 0512 hours, you reported finding abandoned equipment. At 0547 hours, you reported locating the first casualty, Peterson, approximately 1.2 miles outside your assigned area. One of the unknown officers leaned forward. Can you explain the decision-making process that led you to abandon your assigned search pattern? The question was directed at the entire squad, but Lena knew they were really asking her. Over the past 2 weeks, her unofficial leadership of Squad B had become impossible to ignore, and in a situation like this, leadership meant responsibility. Sir, she began, when we found Peterson's equipment caught in flood debris, it indicated he'd been swept downstream by the water. Following the drainage pattern was the logical way to locate him. Logical, the second unknown officer repeated, but not authorized. Operational protocols require you to report findings and await instructions before leaving your assigned area. Yes, sir, Lena replied. But the storm system was moving through rapidly. By the time we could have requested permission, received new orders, and repositioned, the casualty might have been dead from exposure. Monroe consulted his notes. After locating Peterson, you made the decision to split your squad, sending 2 members to coordinate medical evacuation while you continued searching for additional casualties. This decision was made without consultation with higher command. Peterson told us where the others had gone, K2 interjected. Martinez was moving toward the eastern rocks, directly into the path of the next flood surge. We had maybe 20 minutes to find him before the water came up again. And Henderson? Monroe asked. She was lost, Madeline said simply. Peterson thought she was trying to navigate back toward base, but with her ankle injury and the visibility conditions, she could have been anywhere in a 5-mile radius. We had to make a choice, follow protocols, or follow people who needed help. The senior officers exchanged glances, their expressions revealing nothing. Finally, Monroe closed his file folder and leaned back in his chair. Squad B, he said. In the space of 6 hours, you violated operational security protocols, abandoned your assigned mission parameters, split your unit without authorization, and made tactical decisions that put additional personnel at unnecessary risk. He paused, letting the weight of the accusations settle. You also successfully rescued 3 casualties who would likely have died from exposure if standard search procedures had been followed. Lena felt something shift in the room's atmosphere, a subtle change in the officers' postures that suggested the conversation was moving in an unexpected direction. The question before us, one of the senior officers said, is whether your success justifies your methods, or whether your methods succeeded despite being fundamentally unsound. Sir, Lena replied, I think the methods succeeded because we adapted to the situation instead of trying to force the situation to fit our methods. Explain. Standard search protocols assume you're looking for competent people who made reasonable decisions under difficult circumstances. But Peterson, Martinez, and Henderson weren't competent in this environment. They were trained for controlled conditions, classroom scenarios, situations where the rules worked because someone else had already solved the hard problems. She paused, choosing her words carefully. When the environment changed, they couldn't adapt. So our response had to change too. Monroe leaned forward slightly. Are you suggesting, Miss Walker, that our training protocols are inadequate? The question felt like stepping onto thin ice, but Lena had come too far to back down now. I'm suggesting that there's a difference between training people to follow procedures and training them to survive when the procedures don't work. Silence filled the debriefing room. Finally, one of the senior officers made a note on his tablet and looked up. Squad B, you're dismissed. Report for standard training rotation in 6 hours. Get some sleep. As they filed out of the room, Lena caught Sergeant Ramirez watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't disapproval exactly, but it wasn't approval either. It was the look of someone making calculations, weighing variables, coming to conclusions that wouldn't be shared until the time was right. Outside in the corridor, her squad mates finally allowed themselves to show the exhaustion they'd been hiding during the debriefing. Think we're in trouble? Marcus asked, rubbing his eyes. We saved 3 lives, Sarah replied firmly. If that's trouble, I can live with it. Walker, K2 said as they reached the barracks entrance. You know they're going to be watching us even more closely now, right? We just made some very important people look stupid. Quote, maybe, Lena replied, pausing at the door. But we also proved something they needed to see. Which is? Lena looked back toward the command building, where lights still burned in the windows of the debriefing room. Somewhere in there, officers were making decisions about the future of the NTST program, about which candidates would advance and which would be sent home, about what lessons could be learned from a night when everything went wrong and a squad of supposed misfits turned out to be the only ones who got everything right. That the real test isn't whether you can follow the plan, she said finally, it's what you do when there is no plan. She pushed through the barracks door, her mud-caked boots leaving prints on the polished floor. Behind her, the desert wind howled across the base, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of more storms to come. But for the first time since arriving at Holloman, Lena felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Not because anyone had told her she was worthy, but because she'd proven it to herself in the only way that mattered. In the mountains of West Virginia, her grandfather had taught her that survival wasn't about having the right equipment or following the correct procedures. It was about paying attention to what the world was telling you, making decisions when the stakes were real, and never leaving anyone behind who could still be saved. Tonight, in the Nevada desert, she'd learned that those lessons applied far beyond the hills of home. And tomorrow, she'd find out whether the National Tactical Survival Trials were ready for someone who'd been taught to lead, not by rank or recognition, but by example and instinct forged in places where mistakes were paid for in blood. The girl in the handmade combat boots had just shown a room full of military professionals that sometimes the most powerful weapon in any arsenal was the willingness to do what needed doing, regardless of what the manual said. Now she'd discover whether they were smart enough to recognize what they'd seen, or too invested in their own assumptions to learn from it. Either way, Lena Grace Walker wasn't backing down. She'd come too far and seen too much to let anyone convince her that following orders mattered more than saving lives. The storm had passed, but the real test was just beginning. The helicopter disappeared over the eastern ridge just after sunrise, leaving Lena alone in a landscape that stretched endlessly in every direction. The pilot had given her exactly 30 seconds to grab her gear and jump clear before lifting off again, the aircraft's departure marking the official beginning of the final phase. 72 hours alone in the desert, with nothing but basic survival equipment and the skills she'd accumulated over a lifetime of preparation. Her drop point was designated on the map as Grid Reference 8 Delta, a cluster of red rocks and scattered Joshua trees that looked identical to a dozen other locations within a 20-mile radius. The checkpoint she needed to reach was marked as a simple X on the topographic chart, 47 miles northeast across terrain that would challenge experienced desert navigators with full equipment and support teams. Lena had 48 hours of water, 3 energy bars, a basic first aid kit, and her mother's compass. Everything else, shelter, additional food, fire-starting materials, navigation aids beyond the magnetic needle pointing steadily north, would have to come from the land itself and the knowledge Boone had spent years drilling into her consciousness. She spread the map on a flat rock and began the methodical process of establishing her position. The helicopter pilot had been precise with the drop coordinates, but precision meant nothing if she couldn't translate those numbers into an understanding of the physical landscape around her. She needed landmarks, reference points, a mental picture of how this particular patch of desert connected to the larger geography she'd been studying for weeks. To the north, a line of mesas created a natural boundary that would be visible from miles away. The eastern horizon was dominated by a distinctive double-peaked mountain that appeared on her map as Jackrabbit Ridge. South and west, the landscape dissolved into the kind of rolling, featureless terrain that could swallow navigators whole if they lost track of their bearing. "Okay, Grandpa," she said quietly, the sound of her own voice strange in the vast silence. "Time to see if all those lessons stuck." The first decision was the most crucial: which route to take toward the checkpoint. The direct path would take her across open desert, exposed to the full force of the sun, but relatively easy to navigate. The longer route would follow a series of arroyos and dry creek beds that would provide shade and shelter, but could become deadly traps if weather moved in. Lena studied the weather forecast data she'd memorized during the pre-mission briefing. High pressure system, no precipitation expected, temperatures reaching 115 degrees by mid-afternoon. The direct route, then. She'd move during the cooler hours before dawn and after sunset, shelter during the heat of the day, and trust her ability to navigate by stars when the sun went down. She began walking at precisely 0630 hours. using the early morning shadows to establish her bearing and maintain direction. The desert seemed empty at first glance, but Lena had learned to see beyond the obvious. Animal trails, almost invisible unless you knew how to look for them, indicated water sources and the safest paths through rocky terrain. The behavior of birds, which direction they flew, where they gathered, how they moved across the landscape, provided information about weather patterns and seasonal changes that wouldn't appear on any meteorological report. By 1,000 hours, the sun had become a physical weight, pressing down on everything it touched. Lena found shelter beneath an overhang of red sandstone and settled in to wait out the worst of the heat. She allowed herself 3 careful sips of water, calculating consumption against distance remaining and the time she'd need to cover it. This was when the isolation really began to bite. For the past 3 weeks, she'd been surrounded by people, squad mates, instructors, the constant background noise of military life. Even during the most challenging exercises, there had always been the knowledge that help was available if things went truly wrong. Now, sitting alone in the desert shade with 45 miles of hostile terrain between her and safety, she felt the full weight of self-reliance settling on her shoulders. She thought of her mother, who'd carried that weight through 2 combat deployments before trading the dangers of Afghanistan for the equally lethal environment of a West Virginia coal mine. Sarah Walker had been trained for situations like this, prepared by military instructors who'd understood that survival was about more than just following procedures. The irony wasn't lost on Lena. The people who dismissed her as unprepared were sitting in air-conditioned buildings right now, monitoring her progress through satellite feeds and radio checkpoints. Meanwhile, she was applying lessons learned from a dead woman and an old man who'd never set foot on a military base, using knowledge passed down through generations of people who'd understood that the wilderness didn't care about your credentials. By 1,400 hours, the temperature gauge on her basic survival watch read 118 degrees Fahrenheit. The desert had become an oven, heat radiating up from the ground in waves that made the distant mountains shimmer like mirages. Nothing moved except the occasional lizard darting between patches of shade, and even the ever-present desert flies had retreated to whatever cool refuges they could find. Lena dozed fitfully in the narrow shade, waking every few minutes to check her position and scan the horizon for any changes in weather or terrain. The hours crawled by with the oppressive weight of a fever dream, time distorted by heat and isolation into something that felt both endless and frighteningly short. At 1,700 hours, she resumed walking. The evening miles were different from the morning's travel. Longer shadows that played tricks with depth perception, cooling air that made movement easier but brought its own challenges. Desert navigation at dusk required different skills than daylight travel. Landmarks that had been clearly visible at noon disappeared into shadow, while new features emerged as the angle of light changed. Lena had covered approximately 15 miles when she found Travis Langston's emergency cache. It was hidden beneath a pile of rocks about 50 yards off her planned route, marked with reflective tape that caught the last rays of sunlight. Inside the improvised shelter, she discovered a water bottle, energy bars, and what appeared to be detailed notes about terrain features and navigation waypoints. The discovery hit her like a physical blow. Travis had cheated. Somehow, probably with help from his connections within the program, he'd pre-positioned supplies along the route. The elite candidate, who'd been held up as an example of military excellence, had been hedging his bets with unauthorized equipment caches. Lena stared at the supplies for a long moment, calculating. Her own water was running lower than she'd hoped, and the additional food would make the difference between completing the course with energy to spare or stumbling across the finish line on pure willpower. It would be so easy to rationalize. Travis had cheated first, the supplies were there anyway, no one would ever know. She left everything untouched and continued walking. The stars came out like scattered diamonds against black velvet, and navigation shifted from visual landmarks to celestial reference points. Polaris, steady and reliable in the northern sky. The Big Dipper, its pointer stars confirming the direction her compass indicated. The subtle glow on the eastern horizon that suggested her destination was still within reach. Mile by mile, hour by hour, Lena pushed deeper into the desert night. Her boots found purchase on rocky ground that would have twisted ankles in daylight, her pace steady despite the weight of exhaustion beginning to accumulate in her muscles. This was the part of survival that couldn't be taught in classrooms. The simple, grinding persistence required to keep moving when everything in your body screamed for rest. At 0230 hours, she stopped for a brief meal and rest break. Half an energy bar, 4 careful sips of water, 10 minutes with her boots off to check for hot spots that might become blisters. The routine was automatic, burned into her consciousness by years of long-distance running and wilderness hiking. She was 30 miles from her drop point, maybe 17 miles from the checkpoint. If she maintained pace and nothing went wrong, she'd reach the finish with several hours to spare. But the desert had a way of making nothing going wrong a dangerous assumption. The sun rose behind her as she crested a low ridge and saw her objective spread out in the valley below. The checkpoint was a simple military shelter surrounded by communication equipment, solar panels, and the kind of utilitarian infrastructure that marked official facilities in remote locations. More importantly, she could see the figures moving around the site, instructors, support personnel, and what appeared to be other candidates who'd already completed the course. Lena allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, then checked her watch. She'd covered 47 miles in under 60 hours, navigating by basic compass and natural landmarks, finding water by following animal sign, surviving 3 days alone in terrain that had defeated supposedly better-prepared candidates. The final mile stretched ahead of her, downhill through scattered rocks and hardy desert vegetation. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else, and her vision occasionally wavered from dehydration and exhaustion, but her pace never wavered. She'd come too far to stumble at the finish line. At 0847 hours, she crossed the perimeter of the checkpoint facility and officially completed the final phase survival exercise. Captain Monroe was waiting for her, clipboard in hand, an expression unreadable as always. Behind him, she could see Sergeant Ramirez and several other instructors, along with candidates from other squads who'd finished the course ahead of her. "Walker," Monroe said, consulting his stopwatch. "Time, 60 hours, 17 minutes. That puts you," he checked a chart on his clipboard, "third overall, behind Kowalski and Kim." Lena nodded, too exhausted for conversation. She'd finished. The specifics of placement seemed less important than the simple fact that she'd proven to herself and everyone else that she could handle whatever the desert chose to throw at her. "There is one issue," Monroe continued, his voice taking on the formal tone that usually preceded official reprimands. "We found evidence of unauthorized supply caches along the route, emergency equipment that wasn't part of the official gear allocation." Lena's heart sank. Had they somehow connected the caches to her? Did they think she'd been cheating? "The caches belong to Langston," Monroe said, answering her unspoken question. "GPS tracking data shows he pre-positioned supplies at multiple points along his planned route. He's been disqualified from the program." "Sir," Lena said quietly, "I found one of his caches. I left it untouched." Monroe's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "You found unauthorized supplies and didn't use them?" "Yes, sir. They weren't mine to take." Sergeant Ramirez stepped forward, consulting her tablet. "According to satellite tracking, you spent approximately 4 minutes at grid reference 7 Golf 4 during your second day. That corresponds to the location of cache site 3. "I was deciding what to do," Lena replied honestly. "And you decided to continue with your own supplies rather than take advantage of equipment that would have made the remainder of your journey significantly easier." "Yes, ma'am." Monroe and Ramirez exchanged a glance that conveyed more than words. Finally, Monroe made a note on his clipboard and looked up. "Walker, report to base medical for evaluation and debriefing. You've got 6 hours to rest and recover. After that, we need to discuss your future in this program." As she walked toward the medical tent, Lena felt the weight of completion settling over her. She'd finished the final phase, proved her competence in the most demanding test the program could devise, and maintained her integrity when it would have been easy to compromise. But Monroe's words suggested that her performance had raised as many questions as it had answered. In a few hours, she'd learn whether excellence without connections was enough to earn a place in the military's most selective program, or whether some barriers couldn't be overcome by competence alone. The medical tent smelled of disinfectant and desert dust, its canvas walls providing blessed relief from the relentless Nevada sun. Lena lay on a narrow cot, while a medic checked her vital signs and documented the various minor injuries she'd accumulated during 3 days alone in the wilderness: scraped knuckles from scrambling over rocks, a small cut on her left calf from desert thorns, sunburn despite her careful use of shade and protective clothing, mild dehydration, Some electrolyte depletion, but nothing serious, the medic announced, making notes on a tablet. You actually came through in better shape than most candidates. Whatever you were doing out there for water management, keep doing it. Through the tent's open flap, she could see other final phase completers moving around the checkpoint facility. Some looked as exhausted as she felt, moving with the careful precision of people whose bodies were running on willpower and little else. Others appeared surprisingly fresh, their gear clean and their postures confident in a way that made her wonder how closely their experiences had matched her own. David Kim sat on a folding chair near the communications equipment, his expression thoughtful as he stared out at the desert landscape. He'd finished second overall, according to the posted results, completing the course in 58 hours with what appeared to be textbook navigation and resource management. When he noticed her watching, he raised his hand in a brief wave that she returned with a tired smile. Walker. Captain Monroe appeared at the tent entrance, his uniform somehow still crisp, despite the heat and remoteness of their location. Medical clearance complete? Yes, sir, the medic replied before Lena could answer. She's dehydrated but stable. I'd recommend 24 hours of rest and regular fluid intake, but she's cleared for normal activities. Monroe nodded curtly. Walker, with me. We need to discuss your performance. Quote, the walk to the command trailer took them past the informal gathering of candidates who'd completed the final phase. Lena caught fragments of conversation, discussions of navigation challenges, equipment failures, moments of doubt during the long desert nights. The tone was respectful, even admiring, as people shared war stories from an experience that had tested them all to their limits. But she also noticed the glances, the way conversations paused as she passed, the subtle shift in body language that suggested her presence was generating discussion she wasn't part of. Word of Travis Langston's disqualification had spread quickly, and with it, the story of her discovery of his supply cache and her decision to leave it untouched. The command trailer was air-conditioned and equipped with banks of monitors showing satellite feeds, weather data, and tracking information from the various exercises in progress. Sergeant Ramirez sat at a workstation, reviewing what appeared to be detailed performance analyses, while two officers Lena didn't recognize occupied chairs around a folding conference table. Walker, Monroe began without preamble, your performance during the final phase raises several questions that need to be addressed before we can determine your status in this program. He activated one of the wall monitors, displaying a satellite map marked with colored lines representing the routes taken by each candidate. Lena's path showed as a steady red line from drop point to checkpoint, remarkably straight and efficient compared to some of the wandering tracks left by other participants. Your navigation was exceptionally precise, Monroe continued. Almost suspiciously so, given the minimal equipment you were carrying and the challenging terrain involved. One of the unknown officers leaned forward. Miss Walker, did you receive any assistance during the exercise? Communications from outside sources? Pre-positioned equipment, any form of support not explicitly authorized by the program? The implication hit her like cold water. They thought she'd cheated. After everything she'd endured, all the miles covered with nothing but her own skills and determination, they suspected her success was somehow fraudulent. No, sir, she replied firmly. I navigated using compass bearings, landmark recognition, and celestial navigation. The same techniques my grandfather taught me in the mountains of West Virginia. Quote, your grandfather, Ramirez said, consulting her notes, was a Vietnam veteran with no formal training in desert survival or advanced navigation. He was a soldier who understood that survival principles are universal, ma'am. The terrain changes, but the fundamentals remain the same. Monroe activated another display, showing detailed timeline data from her journey. At 1,847 hours on your second day, you made a navigation correction that put you back on optimal course after drifting approximately 2 degrees off bearing. This correction occurred during twilight hours with limited visibility. How do you explain the precision of this course adjustment? Lena studied the data, remembering that specific moment, the way the evening light had revealed a rock formation that didn't match her mental map of the area, the careful recalculation using Polaris and the surrounding terrain features. I was using the North Star for celestial navigation, she explained. When it became visible, I could confirm my compass bearing and correct for any drift that had accumulated during daylight travel. Celestial navigation, the second unknown officer repeated skeptically. That's a complex skill requiring years of training and specialized equipment. Sir, my grandfather taught me to navigate by stars when I was 12 years old. It's not complex if you start with the basics and practice regularly. Polaris points north. The Big Dipper confirms the location of Polaris. If you know how to find north, you can maintain any bearing. The officers exchanged glances that suggested professional skepticism warring with growing realization that she might actually be telling the truth. Miss Walker, the first officer said, "You're claiming that informal training from a non-professional instructor gave you navigation skills superior to candidates who've completed advanced military coursework and wilderness survival programs." "I'm not claiming anything about other candidates, sir. I'm stating that I navigated 47 miles of desert terrain using techniques I learned from my grandfather and skills I developed through years of practice in the mountains of Appalachia." Monroe consulted another set of documents. "Your water consumption was remarkably efficient. Most candidates finish the course severely dehydrated despite carrying identical supplies. You arrived with approximately 8 ounces of water remaining. How do you account for this discrepancy?" Quote, "I rationed carefully and found supplemental sources," Lena replied. "Animal trails led me to a seep spring about 18 miles from the drop point. I was able to refill 1 water bottle and continue with adequate hydration." "You found an unmapped water source in the middle of the desert?" "Animals don't lie about where water is, sir. They can't afford to waste energy on false leads. If you follow their trails and watch their behavior, they'll lead you to resources that might not appear on any survey map." Ramirez looked up from her workstation. "Satellite imagery confirms a water source at the coordinates where you deviated from your planned route. It's seasonal, only active during certain times of year, which is why it's not marked on standard topographic charts." The silence in the trailer stretched for several heartbeats. Finally, Monroe closed the file folder he'd been consulting and leaned back in his chair. "Walker," he said, "in 22 years of military service, I've never encountered a candidate who performed at your level using such basic equipment and informal training methods." "Sir, I'm not finished." Monroe's voice carried the authority of absolute command. "Your performance during the final phase was exceptional by any measure. But more than that, your conduct throughout this program has demonstrated qualities that we specifically recruit for but rarely find." He stood, moving to the window that looked out over the desert landscape, where she'd spent the last 3 days proving herself. "Leadership isn't about rank or recognition," he continued. "It's about making the right decisions when the stakes are real and the consequences matter. You've done that consistently, during the storm rescue, when you found Langston's supply cache, in every situation where you've had to choose between personal advantage and doing what's right." One of the unknown officers spoke for the first time since the interrogation began. "Miss Walker, I'm Colonel Harrison, Deputy Director of the Advanced Operations Training Program. Based on your performance here, and the recommendation of Captain Monroe and Sergeant Ramirez, I'm prepared to offer you a position in the next phase of specialized training." Lena felt something shift inside her chest. Not relief exactly, but a kind of settling that came with official recognition of what she'd always known about herself. "However," Colonel Harrison continued, "there are conditions. The next phase involves training scenarios that make this program look like summer camp. The physical demands, the psychological pressure, the technical complexity. Everything increases exponentially. Are you prepared for that level of commitment?" "Yes, sir," she replied without hesitation. "And you understand that accepting this position means leaving your old life behind? The people you'll work with, the missions you'll undertake, the places you'll go. None of it will be the kind of experience you can share with family and friends back home." Lena thought of Pine Ridge, of the mountains where her mother was buried and her grandfather still waited for letters that came less frequently with each passing month. She thought of the girl who'd left West Virginia with nothing but handmade boots and impossible dreams, and the woman who'd emerged from the Nevada desert with skills that even military professionals found difficult to believe. "Sir," she said quietly, "I've been preparing for this my whole life. I just didn't know what I was preparing for." Colonel Harrison smiled, the first expression of warmth she'd seen from any senior officer since arriving at Holloman. "In that case, Miss Walker, welcome to the program. Sergeant Ramirez will provide you with your new orders and transportation arrangements. You have 48 hours to complete any personal business before reporting to your next assignment." As the meeting concluded and she prepared to leave the trailer, Lena caught sight of her reflection in one of the dark monitor screens. Sunburned, exhausted, still wearing the desert-stained uniform that had carried her through 3 days of the ultimate test, she looked like exactly what she'd become, A survivor who'd earned her place not through connections or credentials, but through competence demonstrated when everything depended on getting it right. Her combat boots had carried her across 47 miles of hostile terrain and into a future she couldn't have imagined when she'd first laced them up in her grandfather's workshop. Now they were about to carry her even farther, into a world where the lessons of the mountains and the wisdom of an old soldier would be applied to challenges that most people would never know existed. The girl from Pine Ridge had become something new, but the boots that had brought her this far would carry her through whatever came next. The mountains of West Virginia looked smaller somehow, their familiar green ridgelines softened by distance and perspective that hadn't existed 6 months earlier. Lena pressed her face to the window of the commercial airliner as it descended toward Charleston, watching the landscape of her childhood unfold below with eyes that had learned to see terrain in terms of tactical advantage, water sources, and escape routes. The government had given her a 2-week leave before reporting to her next assignment, a classified facility in Colorado, where she'd join a program so secretive that even its name had been redacted from her orders. 2 weeks to settle her affairs, they'd said, though what affairs a 17-year-old from a dying coal town might have to settle had apparently not occurred to the bureaucrats who'd processed her paperwork. The truth was simpler. She needed to say goodbye to the person she'd been before the desert changed her, and that person was buried so deep in these mountains that it would take more than official leave time to excavate her completely. Boone was waiting at the baggage claim, his weathered face breaking into a grin that took 20 years off his appearance when he spotted her coming down the escalator. He'd aged in the months since she'd left, new lines around his eyes, a slight stoop to his shoulders that suggested the weight of solitude had been harder to bear than he'd admitted in his letters. "Lena, girl," he said, wrapping her in arms that still felt strong enough to hold up mountains. "You look different. Taller, maybe, or just more." She laughed, feeling tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying begin to dissolve. "Different how?" "Like you found what you were looking for," he replied, studying her face with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades reading subtle signs in hostile environments. "Or maybe like what you were looking for found you." The drive back to Pine Ridge took them through familiar territory that felt simultaneously unchanged and completely transformed. The same gas stations and roadside diners, the same weathered billboards advertising long-closed businesses, the same narrow roads winding through valleys where coal trucks had once rumbled day and night. But now she saw it all through eyes trained to assess defensible positions and resource availability, to identify the strategic value of high ground and the tactical limitations of scattered settlements. "Place looks different to you now," Boone observed, catching her scrutiny of the landscape. It wasn't a question. "Everything looks different," she admitted. "I keep seeing it like a map, thinking about how you'd move through it or defend it or survive in it." "That's what training does," he said quietly. "Changes how you see the world. Question is whether it changes who you are underneath all that new knowledge." The house looked exactly as she'd left it, the same sagging front porch, the same collection of mismatched furniture that had accumulated over decades of making do with what was available. But walking through the front door felt like stepping into a museum exhibit of her former life, everything preserved exactly as she'd left it, but somehow drained of the significance it had once carried. Her bedroom still contained the collections of topographic maps and wilderness survival manuals that had been her treasures before the military opened doors to resources she'd never imagined. The mirror above her dresser reflected back a face that belonged in those surroundings but no longer entirely fit them. Sharper features honed by months of physical challenges, eyes that had seen things most people from Pine Ridge would never encounter, bearing that suggested confidence earned through trials that couldn't be explained to anyone who hadn't endured them. That evening, sitting on the front porch with Boone while fireflies began their nightly dance among the oak trees, she found herself struggling to bridge the gap between who she'd become and the place that had shaped her. "Tell me about it," he said simply, rocking slowly in the chair that had been his father's and his grandfather's before that. So she did, not the classified details that would remain locked away for the rest of her life, but the essence of what the past 6 months had taught her about herself and the world beyond the mountains. She told him about the desert and the candidates who'd looked down on her until she'd proven them wrong. About the storm and the rescue and the moment when she'd realized that leadership wasn't something you were granted but something you earned by making the right choices when everything hung in the balance. "Sounds like they got more than they bargained for when they recruited you," Boone said when she finished. "Maybe. Or maybe they got exactly what they were looking for, and just didn't recognize it at first. Quote, he nodded slowly, understanding passing between them in the comfortable silence that had always existed when words weren't necessary. Your mama would be proud, he said finally, not just of what you accomplished, but of how you did it. With honor. The next morning brought visitors. First Mrs. Henderson from the library, then neighbors who'd heard she was home. Finally, a small crowd of people who wanted to hear about her adventures from someone who'd actually lived them. The story grew in the telling, filtered through the limitations of what she could share and the hunger of small-town listeners for tales of larger worlds. But it was K2's arrival on the third day that brought Lena's two worlds into unexpected collision. Keisha Davenport stepped out of a rental car wearing civilian clothes that couldn't quite disguise the military bearing she'd acquired, her infectious grin as wide as ever but backed now by confidence that hadn't existed when they'd first met in the desert. "Surprise!" she announced, bounding up the front steps like she'd been visiting the Walker house her entire life. "Hope you don't mind me crashing your hometown tour, but I had some leave time and figured I should see where the famous mountain girl actually came from." "K2?" Lena stared in amazement. "What are you doing here? How did you even find?" "Girl, you think the military doesn't know exactly where all its assets are at any given time? Plus, your grandfather's been corresponding with my grandmother about traditional survival techniques. Apparently, they bonded over stories about stubborn granddaughters who think they know everything." The next week unfolded like a dream sequence, two worlds blending in ways Lena had never imagined possible. K2 charmed everyone she met with her combination of urban sophistication and genuine appreciation for mountain wisdom. She listened to Boone's stories about wilderness navigation with the focused attention of a student, while regaling him with tales from her Detroit childhood that painted pictures of survival skills learned in very different but equally demanding environments. "You know what's funny?" K2 said one evening as they sat by the creek behind the house, watching the sun set over familiar ridgelines. "All those rich kids at Holloman, they thought we were the ones who didn't belong. But look at us now. You're headed for some super-secret program that probably doesn't even exist on paper, and I just got accepted into officer candidate school." "We earned it," Lena replied simply. "Damn right we did. And you know what else we earned? The right to help other people earn it too." That conversation planted the seed of an idea that would grow throughout Lena's remaining days at home. By the time K2 had to leave for her own next assignment, they'd sketched out the framework for something unprecedented. A wilderness survival program specifically designed for girls from backgrounds like their own, places where potential was abundant but opportunities were scarce. "We'll call it the Ridge Runner Program," K2 suggested, as she prepared to drive back to the airport. "Teach practical skills, build confidence, show girls that the mountains, or the city, or wherever they come from, don't have to limit what they become." "Think anyone would be interested?" Lena asked. "Girl, look around. Half the kids in this town probably have the same hunger you did. They just don't know there's anywhere to take it. Same thing in Detroit. Probably same thing everywhere people learn to survive by making do with what they have." The idea took root and began to grow, fed by conversations with local teachers who spoke of bright students with no clear path forward, with community leaders who understood that economic changes had left entire generations adrift, with young women who approached Lena shyly at the grocery store or church, asking quiet questions about what it was really like out there beyond the mountains. By her final week at home, Lena had outlined a program structure, identified potential funding sources, and begun building the network of contacts that would make the Ridge Runner program a reality, rather than just an ambitious dream. The girl who'd left Pine Ridge with nothing but handmade boots and impossible hopes was preparing to return to the outside world with the resources and connections necessary to build bridges for others to follow. Her last night at home, she walked the mountain trails one final time, her boots finding familiar purchase on paths she'd run countless mornings in preparation for challenges she'd never imagined. The compass Boone had given her pointed steadily north, just as it had during her desert trials. But now it seemed to be indicating something beyond mere direction, a purpose that extended past personal achievement into something larger and more enduring. At the summit of Lookout Point, where she'd always gone to think and plan and dream, she sat on the same rock that had been her thinking place since childhood, and looked out over the valley where she'd learned the lessons that had carried her farther than anyone had thought possible. Tomorrow she'd board a plane for Colorado, and a program so classified that she'd probably never be able to discuss it with anyone outside the intelligence community. She'd join an elite unit that recruited from the top 1% of military candidates, using skills learned from a Vietnam veteran and a dead woman to serve a country that was finally beginning to understand what she had to offer. But she'd also carry with her the responsibility to remember where she'd come from and ensure that other girls from places like Pine Ridge would have chances to prove what they were made of. The Ridge Runner program would be her legacy, her way of honoring the lessons Boone and her mother had taught her about leaving no one behind who could still be saved. The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, green and ancient and patient in the way that only geological time could teach. Somewhere out there, other girls were running solitary miles and dreaming impossible dreams, not knowing that the world was finally ready to see what they might become if given the chance. Lena Grace Walker had worn her combat boots across 47 miles of Nevada desert and into a future she couldn't have imagined. Now she was preparing to walk even further, carrying with her the knowledge that the greatest victory wasn't personal achievement, but the ability to lift others up to places they'd never thought they could reach. The girl from Pine Ridge had become a bridge between worlds, and tomorrow she'd begin the work of helping others cross over. 3 years later, Lena Grace Walker stood at the edge of the same Nevada desert where her transformation had begun, but everything else had changed. The morning sun painted the red rocks in familiar shades of gold and amber, and the dry air carried the scent of sage and possibility. Behind her, 37 young women from places like Pine Ridge, Detroit, rural Montana, and inner-city Phoenix adjusted their backpacks and checked their equipment with the nervous energy of people about to attempt something they'd never imagined possible. The Ridge Runner program had grown beyond her wildest dreams. What had started as conversations on Boone's front porch had become a nationally recognized initiative, funded by military contracts and private foundations, staffed by veterans who understood that potential came in packages that didn't always look conventional. The program's logo, a pair of worn combat boots against a mountain silhouette, had become a symbol of earned excellence that opened doors throughout the military and civilian sectors. "Nervous?" K2 asked, materializing beside her with the silent approach that 3 years of specialized operations had drilled into her movements. Second Lieutenant Keisha Davenport now, but still the same irrepressible force who'd befriended a mountain girl when everyone else was betting against her. "Excited," Lena replied, watching her newest class of candidates go through their final equipment checks. "Look at them. 6 months ago, half these girls had never been more than 50 miles from home. Now they're about to tackle the same desert that broke Travis Langston." Among the candidates, she could see echoes of her younger self. The quiet determination of Maria Santos from rural Texas, the fierce intelligence of Ashley Chen from a Pittsburgh housing project, the mountain wisdom of Rebecca Mills from eastern Kentucky coal country. Each carried skills learned from grandparents and necessity, knowledge gained from surviving in places where making do was an art form. "Attention, candidates," Lena called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned the right to demand excellence. "Today marks the beginning of your final assessment. For the next 72 hours, you'll navigate 47 miles of desert terrain, using only the skills you've learned and the equipment you've earned." She paused, remembering her own terror and excitement standing in this same place, wearing boots held together with duct tape and dreams. Some of you will discover capabilities you didn't know you possessed. Others will learn that surviving isn't about having the best gear. It's about making the right decisions when everything depends on getting it right. Quote, a hand shot up Rebecca Mills, whose Appalachian drawl had drawn snickers during the first week of training, before she demonstrated her ability to find water sources that GPS couldn't locate and navigate by stars that others couldn't even see. "Ma'am, what happens if we fail?" Lena smiled, thinking of all the people who'd asked her similar questions over the years, and all the ways those questions had missed the point entirely. "You can't fail," she said simply. "You can learn, you can adapt, you can discover that your definition of impossible was too small, but failure? That only happens when you stop trying to find a way forward." As the candidates moved out into the desert, spreading across the landscape like seeds carried on desert wind, Lena felt the familiar pull of the horizon. Her own combat boots, still the same ones Boone had helped her rebuild, though reinforced now with materials that hadn't existed in his garage workshop, were ready for the miles ahead. She'd completed missions that would never appear in any official record, earned commendations that couldn't be displayed publicly, and developed skills that most people couldn't comprehend. But watching these young women walk into their own transformations reminded her that the greatest victories were always the ones you shared. "Coming with us?" K2 asked, shouldering her own pack. "Wouldn't miss it," Lena replied. "Someone needs to be out there when they realize what they're truly capable of." The desert stretched endlessly ahead, beautiful and dangerous and full of lessons for those brave enough to learn them. Somewhere out there, 37 young women were about to discover that the distance between who they were and who they could become was exactly as far as they were willing to walk. Lena Grace Walker laced up her boots, checked her compass, and began to run. But this time, she wasn't running alone. Behind her, the next generation of leaders was learning to keep pace, ready to carry the lessons of the mountains and the wisdom of worn leather into whatever challenges awaited them. The girl who'd been laughed at for her homemade boots had become the woman who taught others to run in their own, and the desert, patient and eternal, welcomed them all. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.